The clink of the spoon against the side of Mark's coffee mug was the only sound in the kitchen. Lena sat across from him, her hands folded neatly in her lap, waiting for him to speak. The silence between them had become its own language over the years. Tense, empty, final. Sunlight streamed through the window behind him, highlighting every wrinkle on his face, every line she had once memorized with love. He wouldn't look at her. When he finally spoke, his voice was flat, not angry, not cold, just detached. "If I'm honest, I regret marrying you." Lena didn't blink. The sentence didn't need repeating. It didn't need emphasis or clarification. It was heavy enough to break something inside her that had held on for too long. She didn't ask why. She didn't argue or cry. She stood up slowly, steadying herself against the table for just a second, and walked out of the kitchen. Upstairs, in their bedroom, everything was in its place. Their bed, neatly made, her robe hanging on the back of the door, his cufflinks resting in the glass tray on the dresser. 40 years of shared space, of routines and roles, of raising 2 children in weathering storms. All of it suddenly felt borrowed, like she had been living someone else's life. She opened the closet and reached for her suitcase. It had dust on the zipper. Every movement was deliberate. She packed with quiet hands, folding clothes with care, not because she planned to come back, but because she still respected what they once were. As she placed her worn diary into the side pocket of her bag, she hesitated. That diary had held every moment she couldn't say out loud, every humiliation she'd absorbed with grace, every celebration no one remembered, every night she'd cried quietly into her pillow. But she changed her mind. She took the diary out, walked over to her nightstand, and tucked it gently into the drawer. Maybe it belonged there, in the home she had built, in the story she was no longer willing to live. Downstairs, Mark remained seated, staring into his coffee as if it might offer a different answer. He didn't ask her where she was going. He didn't try to stop her. For a man who claimed to regret their entire marriage, he looked oddly calm. Or maybe just relieved. She picked up her keys, opened the door, and walked out into the bright morning light. The air was crisp. The sky was clear. The world didn't stop. It never does. She didn't slam the door. She didn't leave a note. She left with everything she needed, and none of what she didn't. Before we start, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories. Before those words shattered her world, Lena believed her marriage, though quiet and predictable, was steady, secure. She'd often told her friends, "We're not flashy, but we're solid." And for most of their 40 years together, she thought that was true. They had routines. They had history. They had a life that felt, if not thrilling, at least dependable. Lena met Mark Carver when she was 22, a newly certified teacher with too many books and not enough furniture in her one-bedroom apartment. He was older by 3 years and already running his father's hardware business. He had a calm confidence about him, the kind that made her feel safe. He wasn't overly affectionate, but he was steady. The type of man who never forgot to take out the trash, always filled her car with gas before a storm, and never raised his voice. They married in the spring. She wore her sister's wedding dress, and he built their first dining table by hand. They weren't wealthy, but they worked together, side by side, and slowly built a home. Lena left her job when their daughter, Grace, was born, and then again when their son, Daniel, arrived 3 years later. It wasn't a sacrifice, she told herself. It was love. It was motherhood. It was what women did. Mark worked long hours, especially in the early years. She understood. He was providing for them. She was the constant, the one who packed lunches, made birthday cakes, sewed Halloween costumes. She kept their family's wheels turning so he could keep them afloat. Every Sunday morning, she made pancakes and coffee, and they'd all eat at the table together. Their sacred tradition, even as the kids got older and the world pulled at them. As time passed, Lena began to take pride in the invisible work, the little details no one else noticed, matching socks in every drawer, fresh sheets every Thursday, the way she remembered how Mark liked his eggs. Not too runny, not too firm. She memorized every preference, every quirk, every silent cue. When the kids left home, the quiet settled in. She had imagined that they'd travel or take up gardening together, or at least enjoy the slow pace of empty nesting. But Mark grew more distant, not closer. He buried himself in news shows and financial articles, often grunting responses to her questions or leaving the room mid-conversation. She assumed it was stress or just the long road of marriage, a natural settling. Not every love story stayed passionate, right? Still, she found joy in small things. She joined a book club with her friend Nora, volunteered twice a week at the library, and began experimenting with recipes she'd never had time to try. When she made something new, she always served it with a hopeful smile, waiting for Mark's approval. Sometimes he gave it. Sometimes he didn't even notice. There were good days, too. Times they'd sit in the backyard sipping iced tea while the dog chased squirrels, or lazy Sunday mornings when he'd bring her a coffee just the way she liked it. Those days mattered. She clung to them. They were proof that love hadn't completely left the house. Looking back, Lena realized how much of her identity had wrapped around making others comfortable, smoothing over silences, filling in the emotional blanks, pretending things were fine. She had taught herself to treasure crumbs, a compliment here, a smile there. She never demanded more. She thought it was enough to be dependable, to be the one who never gave up. When Grace got married, Lena helped plan every detail, from floral arrangements to seating charts. Mark just signed checks and showed up in a tux. Grace barely acknowledged her effort in the thank you speech. "Dad worked so hard to make this day happen," she'd said. Lena smiled through it, clapping with the crowd, her heart quietly wilting inside her. And yet, Lena never stopped believing they were a team, that what they had was real, that love was meant to evolve, even if it sometimes faded around the edges. She never prepared for the day when Mark would look her in the eye and reduce 4 decades of partnership into a regret. Because despite all the signs, the silences, the indifference, the hollow smiles, Lena had still believed in them. Until he spoke, and her entire past tilted under her feet like a trapdoor. The first time Lena truly questioned her place in Mark's heart, it was such a subtle moment. It might have slipped past unnoticed, if not for the way it stayed with her, long after everyone else had forgotten. It was their 25th wedding anniversary. Grace and Daniel had both flown in for the weekend, and Nora had helped Lena prepare a small dinner party. She wore a soft blue dress Mark once said brought out her eyes. She curled her hair, dabbed on the perfume he used to buy her for Christmas, and set the table with their wedding china. The set they only used once a year. Mark arrived home late. He walked in wearing a frown, muttered something about traffic, and kissed her cheek distractedly. His tie was crooked. He hadn't even changed. Lena noticed the absence of a gift but said nothing. She didn't want to make him feel guilty. That had never been her style. Throughout dinner, he told stories. About work, about a client's new boat, about how tired he was of city taxes. The guests laughed politely. He was still charming, still able to fill a room with his presence. But Lena noticed something new. Not once did he mention her. Not their anniversary, not their years together, not the children they'd raised or the life they had built. She smiled through it anyway. After dessert, someone raised a toast. Nora clinked her glass and said, "Here's to Lena and Mark, 25 years and still going strong." There were cheers, and someone asked Mark to say a few words. He stood, adjusted his tie, and gave a small smile. "Well, I guess we've made it," he said. "A quarter century. That's a long time to tolerate anyone." A few people laughed. Lena tried to. He continued. "I mean, you marry young, you figure it out as you go, right? You settle in. Get used to each other's weird habits. Eventually, it becomes easier to stay than to leave." Lena's heart sank. There was no "I love you," no gratitude, no reflection. Just a casual public declaration that their decades together were little more than endurance. When he sat down, he didn't even glance at her. That night, after the guests left, Lena cleaned the kitchen while Mark turned on the television. She stood at the sink, hands submerged in warm water, wondering what she had missed. Had she imagined their closeness? Had he always felt this way? She wanted to ask, but the words lodged in her throat. She told herself it was the stress of the evening, that he didn't mean it that way, that he was tired. But the truth hovered there in her mind, unspoken. From that night on, small shifts began to multiply. She noticed how he would interrupt her mid-sentence, finishing her thoughts with dismissive guesses. How he started rolling his eyes when she reminded him of errands or appointments. How he never asked about her day, and when she volunteered details, he would respond with, "That's nice," without looking up. Once, while she was reading a new novel she was excited about, she tried to share a passage with him. He waved her off, saying, "You always get too emotional about these things." When they were at a neighborhood barbecue, someone asked Lena what she had been doing with her time now that the kids were gone. Before she could answer, Mark chimed in, "She's become a professional worrier, always organizing something, can't sit still." The men chuckled. It was the way he said it, not cruel, just careless, like she was background noise, like she no longer mattered. And that's when Lena started to wonder. When did she stop being a partner and start being an accessory? She still cooked dinner every night, still left him little notes on the fridge, still rubbed his shoulders when he came home sore. But something had shifted. His appreciation had evaporated, not with anger, but with indifference. He'd stopped seeing her, or maybe he chose not to. But Lena saw everything. She just didn't want to believe it yet. So she told herself it was a phase, that long marriages went through this, that love, like old floors, creaked under pressure, but still held the weight. She patched over the cracks with hope, with history, with habit. But deep down, something had already started to fracture, and she knew, even then, that one day it might break completely. It wasn't one big betrayal that broke Lena's spirit. It was the slow, persistent peeling away of her presence, like wallpaper curling off a wall, unnoticed until the room felt bare. Mark never yelled. He never hit. He didn't cheat, at least not in the obvious sense. Instead, he withdrew in pieces. At first, it looked like forgetfulness. Then it started to feel like erasure. It began with mornings. He used to hand her a cup of coffee, always the way she liked it. A splash of cream, no sugar. Now he'd brew his own, pour one mug, and walk past her without a word. When she asked if he had time to eat breakfast together, he'd shrug. "I've got emails." She still made his eggs anyway. They often went cold on the plate. He stopped saying good night. That was the one that stung the most. For decades, no matter how tired or distracted he was, Mark had always mumbled it. Sometimes from the bathroom, sometimes already half asleep, but it had been their ritual. One night, Lena whispered, "Good night," as she climbed into bed beside him. No response. She waited. Nothing. He was awake. She knew he was awake, but he said nothing. The next night, she said nothing too. And so the silence grew roots. He started scheduling dinners with friends and clients without telling her. She would learn about them when he was halfway out the door, buttoning his jacket, casually saying, "Oh, I'll be late tonight." When she asked if she should wait up, he said, "Don't bother. You hate these work dinners anyway." That wasn't true. She used to love getting ready, putting on her favorite earrings, hearing him brag about her homemade desserts. But he hadn't invited her in over a year. On Sundays, she still made pancakes. He stopped coming down until they were cold. He had excuses, always work or fatigue or just not in the mood. He wasn't unkind, just absent, like a ghost in the house, like someone who used to know her but had since forgotten. When she mentioned feeling lonely, he told her she was too sensitive or reading into things. So she stopped mentioning it. Her birthday came and went without a card. When she reminded him gently, he looked annoyed. "Do we still do that? I thought we agreed not to make a big deal of birthdays." They had never agreed to that. In fact, the year before, She had spent an entire afternoon baking his favorite German chocolate cake. He didn't ask what she wanted for dinner that night. She microwaved leftovers and ate alone at the kitchen counter while he watched TV in the den. Every now and then, Lena would find herself staring at her reflection in the hallway mirror, not looking for beauty, just checking if she still looked like someone worth noticing. She started buying small things for herself: a silk scarf, a new book, a lavender lotion. Not because Mark would notice, he didn't, but because it reminded her she still existed. Grace called occasionally, always in a rush. The conversations revolved around her own children, her job, her stress. Lena listened, gave advice, reassured her. She didn't mention how quiet the house had become, how sometimes whole days passed without Mark saying more than a sentence to her. She didn't want to seem needy. Daniel texted more often than he called. Quick updates, emojis, a photo of his dog. Lena replied with warmth, always ending with, "Miss you," which he usually didn't answer. She understood. He was busy. Everyone was busy. One afternoon, she spent hours cooking a roast. Mark walked in, sniffed the air, and said, "That smells heavy. I'll probably just have a salad." She stood at the stove, spoon in hand, and nodded as if that didn't feel like a slap. That night, she ate alone again. She started writing more. In her diary, she chronicled the absence, the little moments of being ignored, the times she felt like furniture. She didn't write with rage, just clarity. Cold, honest clarity. Each entry ended the same way. "Still here. Still me." Nora noticed. "You're disappearing, Lena," she said one day over coffee, piece by piece. Lena smiled sadly. "I know, but I don't think he even sees the difference." That was the ache Lena carried. Not that Mark stopped loving her, but that he didn't even notice she was fading. She had spent decades making his world run smoothly, quietly keeping everything together, and now she was just background. She used to feel like a partner. Now she felt like a shadow. It was a Saturday in spring, the kind of day that should have felt light and full of promise. Lena had been planning the family brunch for weeks. Grace and her husband were bringing the kids. Daniel was flying in from Chicago for a quick weekend visit, and even Mark seemed mildly interested when she mentioned it on the calendar. She poured herself into the preparations. Fresh flowers on the table, blueberry muffins from scratch, linen napkins folded into little fans. She wanted it to feel special, not just for them, but for herself. It had been a long time since their home felt joyful. Mark didn't help, but she didn't expect him to. He never offered anymore. He came down late, already dressed in his golf polo, fiddling with his phone as he poured himself a glass of orange juice. Lena, still in her apron, greeted him with a hopeful smile. "I made everything you like," she said, setting a hot tray of quiche on the table. He looked over it briefly. "Didn't we have this last year?" The comment stung, but she brushed it off. "It's Grace's favorite," she replied, setting down the silverware. The doorbell rang. Grace entered with her usual distracted energy, kids tumbling behind her like leaves in the wind. She barely looked at Lena before heading to the living room. Daniel came in shortly after, warm as always, giving his mom a proper hug and complimenting the smell of the house. They sat down to eat. Conversation bounced lightly between Grace's job and Daniel's latest apartment hunt. Mark chimed in occasionally, mostly to insert sarcasm or critique. Lena tried to stay present, soaking in the noise of family, the clinking of forks, the sound of laughter, even if none of it was aimed at her. Midway through the meal, Grace reached for a muffin, took a bite, and said, "Ugh, Mom, these are so dry. Did you change the recipe?" Lena felt the flush rise in her cheeks. "No," she said softly, "same one as always." Grace wrinkled her nose and put it down. "Maybe it's the altitude or something." Mark chuckled. "She's always had a talent for making things complicated." He took a sip of coffee, then added, "Remember when she made that birthday cake for Daniel and forgot the sugar?" There was a beat of silence, then laughter. Daniel included. "I was 6, Dad," he said. "I thought she was trying to poison me." Mark grinned. "Yeah, well, at least it looked good. She always puts in the effort. It's the execution that trips her up." The table erupted in more laughter. Lena stared at her plate. She felt the burn behind her eyes, but she didn't cry. Not in front of them. Not in front of Mark. She forced a smile, picked up her napkin, and dabbed at the corner of her mouth like something delicate and fragile might break if she moved too fast. Daniel, catching the change in her expression, shifted slightly in his chair. "The quiche is really good, Mom," he offered, his voice quiet but genuine. But the moment had passed. The humiliation had already taken root. Not loud or explosive, but sharp in its intimacy. This wasn't some stranger ridiculing her in public. This was her husband, her daughter, laughing at her in the house she had built with her bare hands over food she made with love. Lena excused herself after dessert. No one stopped her. In the kitchen, she stood at the sink, staring out the window while hot water ran over the plates. The same plates she had washed 1,000 times before. The same view of the backyard garden she had tended alone for years. She heard their voices drifting in from the other room, light, content, unbothered. That was the moment something shifted in her, not snapped. Lena didn't break that way, but she felt something inside her settle, solidify, like a door quietly closing in the back of her mind. They didn't see her, not really. She wasn't a person in their lives anymore. She was a function, a role, a background presence they expected to keep smiling, keep cooking, keep absorbing the blows with grace. That night, after everyone had left, Mark patted her on the shoulder as he walked upstairs. "You did good today," he said. They were happy. Lena smiled faintly, nodded, and waited until he disappeared down the hallway. Then she sat at the table in the dim kitchen light and wrote one sentence in her diary. "I think I'm done being the joke in my own story." Lena didn't storm out. She didn't scream or slam doors. When she finally walked away, it was with the quiet resolve of someone who had already left 100 times in her heart. It had been 3 weeks since the brunch. The humiliation still lingered, replaying in her mind at night while Mark snored beside her, blissfully unaware. She no longer bothered to cook much. Meals were simpler. Eggs, toast, soup from a can. Mark didn't comment. He barely noticed. He spent more time out of the house now, golfing or meeting the guys for dinner. Lena stopped asking where he was going or when he'd be back. The answers no longer mattered, but the silence between them had changed. Before, it was filled with hope. Now, it was heavy. Final. One Tuesday morning, Lena stood in front of her closet, holding a dress she hadn't worn in years. It was deep green, elegant but modest, and it reminded her of who she used to be. Someone who liked to dress up, who felt seen. She tried it on and stared at her reflection. It still fit. She didn't cry, but she did take a deep breath, the kind you take when you've made a decision that can't be undone. She placed the dress carefully on the bed, then pulled her suitcase from the back of the closet, the same one she had used to visit her sister in Oregon years ago. It still smelled faintly of lavender. She laid it open and began folding clothes. Not with panic, not with urgency, but with intention. Comfortable shoes, her favorite sweater, a few books, a framed photo of Daniel and Grace when they were small. She packed the essentials and then a few things just for her. Things she hadn't allowed herself in a long time. Her diary sat on the nightstand. She stared at it for a long moment, then picked it up and tucked it into her handbag. Mark came home mid-afternoon. She was standing at the kitchen counter holding a cup of tea. He gave her a glance, then walked past her toward the den. "Did you pick up the dry cleaning?" he asked. She didn't answer. He turned, irritated. "Lena?" She looked at him. Really looked. At the man who once held her hand in the hospital when Daniel was born. The man who built her a bookshelf for her birthday the first year they were married. The man who had, piece by piece, unraveled her without ever realizing what he was doing. "I'm leaving," she said. Mark blinked. What? She gestured toward the suitcase by the stairs. I'm going to stay with Nora for a while. For what? His voice was more confused than angry. What's going on? Lena's voice didn't shake. I need to remember who I am, because this, whatever we've become, it's not living. He laughed bitterly. So now you're the victim? No, she replied calmly. Not anymore. Mark stared at her like she'd just grown wings. She could see him calculating the inconvenience, the embarrassment. But not once did he ask her to stay. Not once did he say her name with warmth. Not once did he look sorry. And that told her everything. She left without ceremony. No farewell toasts, no packed lunches, no folded goodbye notes. Just a woman walking out of a house she had once dreamed in, now suffocated in. Nora met her at the door with open arms. Her friend didn't ask questions, didn't say, I told you so. She simply opened the guest room and said, This is yours for as long as you need. That first night, Lena sat on the small twin bed, her suitcase still zipped. The room was quiet. Too quiet. For the first time in years, no one asked her what was for dinner. No one tossed their laundry near her feet. No one made her feel like a burden in her own home. And yet, her chest ached, not from regret, but from release. She opened her diary and wrote, I'm not angry. I'm not bitter. I'm not broken. I'm just tired of being invisible. And today I chose to be seen, if only by myself. Outside, the wind brushed through the trees, as if the world itself whispered, finally. Lena hadn't expected the quiet to feel so sharp. The first few days at Nora's passed in a blur. The guest room was clean and cozy. A twin bed, a nightstand with a ceramic lamp, a window that let in the afternoon sun. Nora had tried to make it feel like home, placing fresh flowers on the dresser and laying out fluffy towels in the hall bathroom. But nothing about it felt like Lena's life. It felt like she had stepped into someone else's calm, someone else's rhythm. Each morning, Lena woke up to the sound of birds outside the window and wondered for a split second if it had all been a dream. But then she'd turn over and see her suitcase still on the floor, her slippers tucked neatly beside it. And she would remember. She'd left. She'd walked away from her home, from the man who didn't love her anymore, from 4 decades of quiet disappointment. And now, what? She didn't cry right away. At first, there was just numbness. She went through the motions, helped Nora with meals, made small talk over tea, even accompanied her to the grocery store. But inside, Lena felt like a hollow version of herself, like she was wearing her own skin loosely. There was no relief, only disorientation. She didn't know what to do with herself when she wasn't being useful to someone else. On the 4th night, she wandered into the kitchen after Nora had gone to bed. The clock above the sink ticked softly. She stood there in the dim light, her hands gripping the edge of the counter, staring at the wall without seeing it. She felt a weight pressing down on her chest, not panic, not fear, something heavier, emptiness. She opened the fridge not because she was hungry, but because she needed to do something. She stared at the rows of neatly stacked containers and closed it again. Her fingers trembled. She walked to the pantry, then the window, then back to the counter. Finally, she sank down to the kitchen floor, curled her knees to her chest, and buried her face in her hands. She didn't sob. It was quieter than that, more surrender than anguish. She thought about all the things she had done right, all the birthdays remembered, the shirts ironed, the gentle advice, the unconditional patience. And she thought about how none of it had been enough. She'd given the best of herself to people who had come to expect it like clockwork, like background music, not maliciously, just carelessly. She wasn't needed. Not really. Even Grace hadn't called since the brunch. Daniel had texted once, "Hey Mom, hope you're okay. Love you." And while it was kind, it felt more like obligation than connection. She didn't blame them. They had their own lives. But the loneliness of being forgotten by the very people she built her life around, that was the hardest part. Lena stayed on the floor for over an hour. When her legs finally ached from the cold tile, she stood up slowly, gripping the counter for balance. She poured herself a glass of water and drank it in silence, as if trying to fill the space inside her with something. That night, she couldn't sleep. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, her mind spinning. Around 3 a.m., she got up and opened her suitcase. She pulled out her journal and sat at the desk by the window. The moonlight streamed in, cool and silver. She opened to a blank page and wrote, "I feel invisible. Not to others, to myself. I don't know who I am when I'm not being useful. I don't know how to be loved without earning it." Tears finally came, but they weren't loud. They rolled down her cheeks quietly like a tide pulling back, exposing everything that had been buried. Rock bottom, Lena realized, wasn't always dramatic. Sometimes it looked like a tidy guest room, a cup of cold tea, and a woman who had forgotten how to take up space in her own life. But beneath the grief, something stirred. Not strength, not yet, just awareness. She wasn't okay, not even close, but for the first time in years, she had said it out loud. And in the stillness that followed, there was a strange kind of comfort. It was a rainy afternoon when Lena stumbled across the box. She had been tidying Nora's spare room out of habit, folding blankets that didn't need folding, realigning books on the shelf, rearranging drawers that were already organized. It wasn't about cleanliness. It was about control, reclaiming something, however small, in a life that now felt completely untethered. As she slid the nightstand to sweep behind it, she noticed her handbag had tipped over. Its contents spilled slightly, including the small leather pouch that held some jewelry, a photo of her kids when they were little, and a folded sheet of paper she didn't recognize. No, not paper. A page from her old journal. It had torn away some time before she left. One of the older entries, creased and smudged near the fold. The date at the top read, October 7th, 1993. Nearly 30 years ago. Lena sat down slowly on the edge of the bed, fingers tracing the faded ink. She remembered that fall. Grace had just started middle school. Daniel had broken his arm on the playground. Mark was working late nights, opening a second hardware store. She began reading. "I think Mark still loves me, but I miss being looked at. I don't mean physically, though sometimes that too. I mean looked at like someone whose thoughts matter, whose feelings have weight. Today I told him I was overwhelmed, and he said, 'You worry too much.' I want to feel held, not managed." Lena blinked hard. She hadn't remembered writing those words, but they felt startlingly current, like her past self had reached forward through time to remind her. This didn't just start. It had been simmering for decades. She rifled through her bag for her full journal. Sitting cross-legged on the bed, she flipped back through years of entries. Some angry, others wistful, most just deeply honest. They told the story not of a crumbling marriage, but of a woman slowly disappearing inside of it. There were entries from joyful days, too. Christmas mornings, Daniel's graduation, quiet evenings when Mark rubbed her feet without being asked. Lena read those too, holding them like artifacts of something once beautiful. She didn't want to rewrite history. Their love had been real, but it had also withered under the weight of routine and resentment. One entry from 2007 caught her attention. "He bought me lilies for our anniversary today. But when I told him they reminded me of funerals, he shrugged and said, 'They were on sale.' I smiled and said thank you. Why do I keep shrinking to make room for his convenience?" She remembered that moment vividly now, not because of the flowers, but because that was the night she went to bed with a migraine and cried silently into her pillow, convinced she was ungrateful. Now she saw it for what it was, another inch lost in the slow erosion of her worth. And then, tucked into the back sleeve of the journal, she found something unexpected. A photo. Faded and sun-washed, it was of her and Mark, young and laughing, standing on the porch of their first home. His arm was slung around her shoulders. She was mid-laugh. eyes closed, mouth open wide in joy. She hadn't remembered that version of herself, full of light, unguarded. Lena stared at that photo for a long time. It struck her, deeply and suddenly, that she hadn't seen herself laugh like that in years. Not a polite smile, not a chuckle for company, a full, genuine laugh. The realization stung, but it also did something else. It sparked something. The pain didn't disappear, but beneath it, a question emerged. Quiet but insistent. If that version of me once existed, could she still? That evening, Lena didn't cook or clean or make tea. She sat by the window, photo in hand, rain tapping softly against the glass. Her journal lay open in her lap. She didn't write a new entry. Not yet. For once, she just sat with the truth. Let it breathe. Let herself feel it without trying to fix it. And in that stillness, surrounded by years of her own quiet voice, she didn't feel lost. She felt seen. Not by Mark, not even by Nora, but by herself. And that was the beginning. Lena's awakening didn't come as a dramatic moment. There was no grand realization, no movie-like epiphany. It came quietly like morning light creeping into a room, soft, steady, and impossible to ignore once it arrived. It started the morning after she reread her journal and found the photo. She woke up before sunrise, the house still and hushed, and walked barefoot to the kitchen. Nora had left a note on the fridge the night before. "Gone to yoga. Back by 9. Make yourself at home." There was a smiley face beside the words, a small gesture, but one that made Lena feel gently cared for. She poured herself a cup of tea and sat by the window, watching the sky shift from black to blue to pink. Something inside her was shifting too. Not a full transformation, but a loosening. The kind of feeling that comes when you finally stop bracing for something that's already happened. For the first time in weeks, she didn't feel like she had to fill the silence. Later that morning, she walked to the corner store alone. It was a small thing, something she might have done 1,000 times before. But this time, she wasn't doing it for anyone else. Not to pick up Mark's favorite cereal, not to grab eggs for breakfast, not because she was expected to run errands. She went because she wanted fresh fruit and time to herself. As she browsed the aisles, she found herself humming quietly. Something she hadn't done in years. A song from her childhood, barely remembered. It made her smile. The cashier, a college-aged girl with chipped purple nail polish, complimented her scarf. Lena thanked her and walked out into the sun, feeling, strange as it seemed, light. That evening, she took a walk around the neighborhood. It had rained earlier, and the air smelled clean. Children's chalk drawings still clung to the sidewalks, and tiny puddles reflected the warm tones of dusk. She found herself breathing deeper, noticing things. The sound of wind through the trees, the feeling of gravel underfoot, the way her body moved. Slower now, but steady. And for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel like she was disappearing. She began to journal differently. Less about pain, more about questions. Instead of documenting neglect, she wrote down things she wanted to try again. Her entries turned from passive reflection into gentle intention. I want to swim again. I miss the feeling of water. What would it feel like to laugh with my whole body again? Can I learn to make art, not just meals? Nora noticed the change, too. Over dinner one night, she said, "You're sitting differently." Lena tilted her head, confused. "Sitting? You used to curl in on yourself," Nora said, sipping her wine. "Now your shoulders are back. You're more here." Lena smiled. "I think I'm waking up." A few days later, Nora invited her to a watercolor class at the community center. Lena hesitated. She'd never painted before. She told herself she didn't have the talent, the time, the reason. But the next morning, she found herself standing in front of a row of paint jars, a brush in her hand, staring at a blank canvas. It terrified her, and then it thrilled her. The first painting was messy, sloppy even, but Lena didn't care. She lost herself in the colors, the brushstrokes, the act of creating something just because she could. She went home with specks of blue on her wrists and a grin she hadn't worn in years. The following weekend, she visited a farmer's market alone, then spent the afternoon baking a plum tart. Not for anyone else, just because she loved the smell. She called Daniel without waiting for him to call first. She ignored Grace's curt texts and didn't chase after more. And one morning, she looked in the mirror and whispered, "You're still in there." Her awakening wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about making Mark regret losing her or proving anything to anyone. It was about returning. To the girl who used to laugh with her eyes closed. To the woman who had dreams that stretched beyond her kitchen walls. To the self that had been waiting, patiently, for her to remember. And now, Lena wasn't just surviving, she was beginning to live. Lena didn't announce her next move. She didn't make a speech, post anything online, or send pointed messages through mutual friends. That wasn't her style. And more importantly, it would have given Mark too much power. Instead, she began preparing for the rest of her life, quietly and methodically. She started by going to the bank. Nora drove her, no questions asked. Lena sat across from the clerk, hands folded in her lap, her voice soft but unwavering as she said, "I'd like to open a personal account just in my name." It felt surreal. She hadn't had an account separate from Mark in over 30 years. Her original one had been closed when they married. This felt like planting a flag in soil she hadn't stood on since her 20s. The clerk asked if she wanted checks. Lena smiled, yes, and the little leather book to hold them in. With each signature, she felt a quiet thrill. Not rebellion, not spite, just agency. She wasn't hiding, but she wasn't explaining either. That same week, she called the county clerk's office and requested a certified copy of the deed to the small lake cabin her aunt had left her years ago. It was in her name alone, a detail she hadn't thought much about at the time. Mark had always dismissed it as too far away to be useful, but to Lena, it was starting to look like freedom. She began organizing. In a folder labeled Lena Next Chapter, she placed copies of documents: the deed, her new bank account, her birth certificate, and her social security card. She updated her emergency contact from Grace, who hadn't called since the brunch, to Nora. She also began removing herself emotionally from the places that had held her captive. She stopped checking her old home security camera feed, which Mark had insisted they install years ago. She stopped waiting for him to call. He hadn't reached out beyond one emotionless text. "Hope you're settled. Let me know if you're coming back for your things." She hadn't replied. Instead, she spent her mornings writing. Not in her diary, but in a fresh journal. One that wasn't filled with sorrow, but with blueprints, ideas, possibilities. She wrote down goals: plant a vegetable garden at the cabin, repaint the porch, learn to make sourdough from scratch. She even jotted down the name of a local real estate lawyer, just in case she needed advice about protecting the property. Nora offered suggestions here and there, but never pushed. They would drink tea in the evenings, feet tucked beneath throw blankets, the TV on low. Once, while watching a documentary about women who reinvented themselves after 60, Lena said, "I don't need to reinvent. I just need to remember." Behind the scenes, Lena began canceling old patterns. She unsubscribed from Grace's relentless group texts about school fundraisers. She stopped watching the news programs Mark used to keep on all evening. She even changed the ringer on her phone. No more sharp tones. Now it chimed softly, reminding her that nothing needed to be urgent anymore. She also started walking by herself every afternoon. Through tree-lined sidewalks and quiet neighborhoods, she felt the rhythm of her own breath, the swing of her arms, the pulse of her body waking up. Sometimes she listened to music, mostly classical, sometimes jazz. Once she even danced a few steps on the trail, smiling at her own ridiculousness. One day she passed a community bulletin board and saw a flyer for a women's retreat, a weekend of journaling, yoga, and silence. Without overthinking, she tore off a tab and emailed the organizer when she got home. She signed up that night. Not to run away from anything, but to move towards something. Each step wasn't loud. It wasn't revenge or rebellion. It was repair. She wasn't planning a dramatic return. She wasn't building a case or plotting a confrontation. She was simply building a life that didn't depend on being needed, tolerated, or dismissed. It was power. Silent, steady, private power. And as Lena closed the last folder on her nightstand, she smiled. She wasn't trying to be seen anymore. She was simply becoming again. Lena never set out to take back power. She hadn't plotted revenge or written out a list of demands. But something curious happened when she stopped explaining herself, when she stopped seeking approval. The people who had overlooked her began to notice her absence. It started with Mark. He called one afternoon, a flat, emotionless tone in his voice. "Have you scheduled a time to come get your things?" Lena had already taken what she needed weeks ago, but she knew what he really meant. He was expecting her to come home eventually, to fold back into the life he had built around his routines. The one where she filled in the gaps, cooked the meals, handled the birthdays, managed the doctor's appointments. "I don't think I'll be coming back," she said calmly. There was a pause. "You mean, not yet?" "I mean, not at all," Mark scoffed. "So you're really throwing it all away after one bad conversation?" That's when Lena knew he hadn't read the room, or the years. "This isn't about one conversation, Mark. It's about a marriage you checked out of a long time ago. I just finally stopped pretending not to notice." He didn't yell. He didn't beg. He just said, "Well, that's sad," and hung up. But the next week, he texted again. "The bills are piling up. I can't find the insurance forms." She didn't respond. He called 2 days later. "Lena, where's the file with all our tax records?" "In the cabinet under the printer," she answered. "Same place it's been for 10 years. His silence was telling. He had never learned where things were, because he never needed to. That's when she realized her absence wasn't a void. It was a mirror. Mark was now forced to look at everything she'd held together, not with noise, not with credit, but with the quiet persistence of someone who loved deeply and asked for little. Nora noticed the shift too. "You're glowing a little," she said one morning over coffee. Lena laughed. "That's just my moisturizer." "No," Nora smiled. "It's something else. You don't shrink anymore when you talk about him." And it was true. Lena wasn't angry. She wasn't seeking validation or justice. But she was rooted now, anchored in a self that was no longer waiting for permission to exist. The subtle shift reached Grace as well. One evening, Lena's phone buzzed with a message. "Dad says you're not answering. Are you okay?" Lena stared at it for a long time. In the past, she would have rushed to reassure her daughter, instinctively jumping into the role of caretaker, peacemaker, fixer. But now, she simply replied, "I'm okay. I just don't want to keep pretending I'm not hurt." There was no reply for 3 days, and then, "I guess I didn't realize how far things had gone. I'm sorry." No explanation, no excuses, but it was something. Even Daniel, who had been quieter throughout, began calling more regularly. "You sound different, Mom," he said during one call, lighter. "I think I am," she replied. One afternoon, she visited the cabin alone, the one her aunt had left her. It was still rough around the edges, but the moment she stepped through the door, something inside her sighed in relief. The walls smelled like cedar and dust, and the floor creaked in familiar, honest ways. She spent the weekend cleaning, rearranging, imagining. She would paint the walls a soft yellow, put a rocking chair on the porch, plant lavender in the garden beds. It wouldn't be grand, but it would be hers, and more importantly, it would be enough. On Sunday evening, as she locked the door and looked out over the lake, Lena felt something she hadn't in years. Not pride, not joy. Sovereignty. She belonged to herself again. Meanwhile, Mark called again the next day, twice. Left a voicemail. "I read some of your journal. I didn't know you felt all that," he said. If I had, maybe I would have done things differently. Lena didn't respond, not out of spite, but because the version of her who had longed to be heard was no longer begging for an audience. The power had shifted, not because she had taken it back, but because she had remembered it was hers all along. Lena hadn't planned to go back to the house. She had already taken what she needed, both practically and emotionally. The last time she stepped through that front door, she walked out with her dignity, her silence, and the realization that staying had been a form of slow disappearance. But when Mark texted again, this time without demands or guilt, she sensed something different. I cleaned out the attic, found some of your things. Would you like to pick them up? I can be out of the house if you prefer. The message was careful, almost respectful, not quite apologetic, but certainly softened. She agreed not because she owed him anything, but because she wanted closure, the kind that only came from looking someone in the eye and telling the truth, unflinching. It was a sunny afternoon when she pulled into the driveway of the house they had lived in for nearly 4 decades. The garden beds she once tended were overgrown. The mailbox leaned to one side. Nothing had changed dramatically. And yet, everything had. Mark opened the door slowly. He looked older. Not just older, but tired in a way Lena had never seen before. His eyes met hers and then dropped, unsure. I didn't expect you to come, he said. I didn't expect you to ask, she replied. They stood there for a beat, the air thick with things unsaid. Then she stepped inside. The living room was dim. Dust clung to the windowsills. The dining table, once the center of their family life, had a pile of unopened mail scattered across it. It felt like a shell of a life, still standing but long abandoned. He gestured to a few boxes near the staircase. These are yours. I wasn't sure what to do with them. Lena walked over and opened the top one. Her photo albums, a few cookbooks, a shawl her mother had knitted years ago, objects once intertwined with love, now carefully placed in cardboard. It felt almost ceremonial. Thank you, she said, then turned to face him fully. I read your journal, he said suddenly. Her stomach tightened. I didn't leave it for you. I know, he nodded, but I needed to know why, and I think now, I do Lena didn't let him off easy. Then you know I stopped being your wife long before I packed my suitcase. He nodded again. I thought you were just always going to be there, like the floors or the roof. I didn't realize you had an end. She looked at him, really looked. Not with bitterness or longing, but with a calm she had earned one painful moment at a time. I tried to tell you, she said quietly, not with ultimatums or anger, with gestures, with patience, with hope. You weren't listening. Mark rubbed the back of his neck, eyes glassy now. I didn't know how to love someone who didn't need fixing. You were whole, Lena, and I think I resented that. For the first time, she felt a flicker of pity, not for what he'd done, but for what he'd missed. All those years he could have known her better, loved her deeper, chosen her again and again as she had done with him. But he hadn't, and that made all the difference. I'm not here to blame you, she said gently. I'm here to say goodbye the right way. Mark swallowed hard. I don't expect you to come back. I'm not, she said, but I don't hate you either. I just don't belong here anymore. She picked up the smallest box and carried it to the door. Mark didn't follow her, didn't plead. He just stood there, hands in his pockets, looking smaller than she'd ever seen him. Before she stepped outside, she turned back one last time. For what it's worth, she said, I hope one day you learn to see people before they leave. And with that, she walked out, not in defeat, but in absolute clarity. No anger, no theatrics, just truth, spoken clean and steady. Lena didn't need revenge. She had her voice back, and that was the most powerful return of all. Lena had no intention of punishing Mark. She wasn't interested in revenge or making him feel the kind of pain he had made her live through for years. She had left that house and that part of herself behind. But sometimes justice finds its own way, not through grand gestures, but through truth finally being seen. A week after their quiet confrontation, Lena received a phone call from Daniel. "Mom, Dad showed me something," he said hesitantly. Lena sat straighter in her chair. "What was it?" "Your journal," he said, "or parts of it." He printed out pages. She was stunned. "He shared it with you?" "Yeah," Daniel said, his voice quieter now. "At first, I was angry. I didn't understand why you left the way you did, but reading what you wrote—" "Mom, I had no idea." Lena exhaled. "I never wanted you or Grace to feel caught in the middle. I just didn't want to keep erasing myself." There was silence on the line. Then Daniel added, "Dad's not doing well. He doesn't say it, but I think reading it broke something in him, or woke something up." Lena wasn't surprised. Mark had spent his whole life avoiding emotion, compartmentalizing discomfort. To read the raw, unfiltered truth of a woman he'd ignored for decades, written not in anger but in quiet sorrow, was perhaps the only thing that could have pierced his defenses. Later that week, Lena received a large envelope in the mail with no return address. Inside was a letter. The handwriting was unmistakable. "Mark's. Lena, I don't know how to apologize for 40 years of missed chances, but I want to try. I read every page you wrote, every line. I saw what I didn't see before. The meals I never thanked you for, the kindness I took as habit, the woman I stopped choosing. You always made life easier for me. I never stopped to think what that cost you. But I see it now. I was wrong. About so many things. I told Daniel he could show Grace. I want her to know too. I want them both to know you were never the problem. I was. I've spoken to the lawyer. The cabin is yours. Always was. But I'm signing over my share of everything else to you. The house, the savings. I don't need it. I don't deserve it. Do with it what you will. Maybe it's too late to make things right. But if anything in me still matters to you, I hope this letter helps bring peace." Mark Lena read the letter twice, not with triumph, but with quiet affirmation. This wasn't about money. It wasn't about ownership. It was about acknowledgement. It was the first time Mark had given something that wasn't transactional. He hadn't asked for forgiveness. He hadn't tried to frame himself as misunderstood. He had simply, finally, told the truth. She never responded to the letter. She didn't need to. It said everything it needed to say. Days later, Grace called. Her voice was brittle at first. "I read what Dad showed me," she said. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," Lena replied. "No, I do," Grace insisted. "I'm sorry. I watched you hold everything together and still sided with him. I didn't understand until I saw it in your words." "I'm not angry anymore," Lena said, "but I also don't need to explain myself anymore." Grace cried softly on the other end of the line. "I just hope it's not too late for us." Lena didn't answer right away. She stared out the window of the cabin, the one Mark had given up without fanfare, the same place where her new life had started. "Let's take it slow," she finally said. "Not because I'm unsure of you, but because I'm learning to take care of myself now, and that has to come first." In the weeks that followed, Lena finalized the paperwork. She sold the old house, donated most of what was inside, used the savings to build a small studio next to the cabin where she could paint, write, and teach community art classes. Justice hadn't come loudly. It hadn't come with court dates or arguments or shouting matches. It came with ownership of her story, her space, and finally, her peace. Mark had collapsed in tears not because someone punished him, but because, for once, he truly saw her. And Lena? She didn't need an apology to move on, but receiving it made her freedom taste even sweeter. Lena had made peace with the idea that some relationships would never return. Her departure wasn't meant to punish or provoke, it was simply a declaration. I matter, too. If those she had loved wanted to find her, they would have to meet her where she was now, not where they left her. A month after Mark's letter and the financial handover, Lena received a message from Grace. Not just a text, a voicemail. Her voice was unsteady, more hesitant than Lena had ever heard it. Mom, I was wrong. Not just about you and Dad, it must be about so much. I thought staying quiet meant being respectful. I thought your patience meant you were fine. But I've been reading your journal, and I see it now. I want to come visit. Just me, no kids, just us. Lena sat on her porch that night, phone in hand, staring up at the starlit sky. She thought about all the years she had spent pouring herself into motherhood. The scraped knees, the school projects, the whispered encouragements during heartbreaks and graduations. She had never stopped loving Grace, but she had stopped chasing her approval. So she said yes, with no expectations. They walked the property together, barefoot in the soft grass, and Grace helped her plant lavender near the front steps. That evening, they cooked together. Not with tension, but with ease, like two women rebuilding something from scratch. No blueprints, just care. When Grace left, she hugged Lena for a long time and whispered, "You're stronger than I ever gave you credit for. I hope I grow into that kind of woman someday." After she was gone, Lena stood alone in her garden, watching the wind move through the tall grass. She didn't cry. She just breathed, slowly, deeply, and let the weight lift off her chest. That night, she walked down to the lake. The moon reflected softly off the water, casting a glow across the dock. Lena sat at the edge, dipping her toes in the cool water. Her journal lay open in her lap, but she didn't write immediately. She just sat, letting the silence cradle her like a long-lost friend. She thought of her younger self, the woman who had held everything together without complaint, the woman who had learned to read rooms better than she read her own needs, the woman who believed that love meant staying. And she thought of the woman she was now. She hadn't become someone else. She had returned to herself. She smiled and finally wrote in her journal, "I didn't leave to be alone. I left to become whole. And now I'm not waiting to be chosen. I choose myself every day in every breath." A hummingbird zipped past, pausing briefly at the flowers she and Grace had planted. The water rippled gently. Somewhere in the trees, wind chimes whispered a song she couldn't name, but somehow knew by heart. Lena closed the journal, not because the story was over,